I heard it throughout my entire childhood that I possessed zero tech talent. Then, the very man who said that walked into my building, looked me in the face, and shook my hand without recognizing me. He thought he was pitching a deal to save his company. Instead, he was walking into the quietest trial of his life. One where I held the gavel. This is how his company had to kneel before the very thing he mocked. My name is Juliana Walker. In the sanitized, glass-walled world of West Coast tech, names often carry less weight than the code you ship or the valuation you command, which was fortunate for me, to the public, and to the venture capital sharks swimming in the waters of Palo Alto. I was simply Juliana, the founder of Ether Logic. My surname was an unnecessary appendage, a piece of metadata I had scrubbed from my public profile years ago to ensure that my achievements stood on their own concrete foundation. I did not want my legacy contaminated by the history of the man who told me I was born without the necessary hardware for success. It was 11 at night when the notification slid across my monitor. The office was empty, save for the hum of the server room down the hall and the cleaning crew vacuuming the lobby 3 floors down. My inbox was usually a graveyard of cold pitches and desperate requests for funding, but this one was flagged as urgent by my filtering algorithm. The subject line read, "Partnership Opportunity and Synergy Proposal Regarding Walker Systems." The name hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. Walker Systems. I stared at the screen, my hand hovering over the mouse. For a moment, the temperature in my climate-controlled office seemed to drop 10 degrees. I was 14 again, sitting at the kitchen table with a soldering iron burning a hole in the tablecloth, waiting for a nod of approval that never came. I shook the memory off, my fingers trembling slightly as I clicked to open the message. The sender was Greg Walker, CEO, founder, father. He had no idea he was emailing his estranged daughter. To him, Ether Logic was just a rapidly ascending star in the enterprise software market, a potential lifeboat for a ship that I suspected was taking on water fast. The email was a masterpiece of corporate desperation masked as strategic confidence. He used words like synergy, legacy integration, and market alignment. It was the language of a man who was drowning but wanted you to believe he was simply inspecting the coral reef. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking in the silence. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that defied my calm exterior. I should have deleted it. I should have marked it as spam and gone home to my apartment overlooking the bay. But curiosity is a poison, and I have always been a willing drinker. I opened the attached pitch deck. It was worse than I imagined. It was a tragedy told in bar graphs and pie charts. I scrolled through the slides, dissecting the anatomy of his failure. Revenue had plummeted by 42% in the last fiscal year. Their client retention rate was abysmal, dropping below 60%, which in our industry is a death sentence. The product roadmap was a joke, filled with buzzwords from 5 years ago. They were trying to sell on-premise server solutions in a cloud-native world. It was like trying to sell horses to people who had just bought cars. Then I turned to the slide titled Executive Leadership Team. There he was, Greg Walker. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, his smile a little too practiced, a little too tight, and right next to him was the face that froze the breath in my lungs. VP of Product Strategy, Sarah Walker, my sister, the golden child. The one who, according to my father, possessed the true instinct for business, the natural intuition that I so clearly lacked. Her photo was professional, polished, projecting an air of competence that the financial data completely contradicted. She was smiling, that same confident smile she used to give me when she explained why I would never understand the complexities of the real world. She was leading the product strategy for a company that was currently driving itself off a cliff. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights of San Francisco. They were begging for a partnership. They wanted access to my algorithms, my client base, my cash flow. They wanted me to save them, without knowing that the hand they were reaching for was the same one they had slapped away a decade ago. I picked up my phone and dialed my executive assistant, knowing she would still be awake. She picked up on the first ring. "I need a slot tomorrow," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, flat and metallic. 10 in the morning. "Who is the client?" she asked, the sound of typing already clicking in the background. "Walker Systems," I replied, "and make it clear to them that attendance is mandatory for the entire C-suite. No proxies, no dial-ins. If the CEO and the VP of product are not physically present in our boardroom, the deal is dead before it starts." There was a pause on the line. "That is short notice." "Juliana, they are based in the South. They will have to fly red-eye." "I know." I said, "If they want this lifeline, they will fly." I hung up and turned back to the empty room. I did not go home. Instead, I began to prepare. I booked the Obsidian Room, our most imposing conference space. It was a glass box suspended in the center of the floor, soundproof, intimidating, designed to make people feel exposed. I arranged the seating chart in my mind. I wanted the sun to be behind me. I wanted them to have to squint to see my face. I checked the inventory for the meeting. Sparkling water, cold, not room temperature, a high-definition projector that would display their failures in 4,000 pixel clarity, and silence. I would not offer small talk. I would not offer coffee. I would offer them nothing but the reality they had been avoiding. I sat there as the hours ticked by, watching the fog roll in over the bay. Obscuring the bridge, 3 o'clock came and went. 4 o'clock. I did not sleep. I could not sleep. A war was waging inside my chest. A conflict between the wounded child who wanted to scream and the pragmatic CEO who needed to execute a strategy. Was this revenge? Was I bringing them here just to humiliate them? To show them the empire I had built from the scraps of my self-esteem? Or was this justice? Was this simply the universe balancing the ledger? Proving that competence cannot be faked forever, and that talent does not care about your DNA or your father's preference. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. My eyes were hard. My posture was rigid. I realized then that the distinction did not matter. Revenge and justice are often just different words for the same corrective action. Tomorrow, they would walk into my world. Tomorrow, the ghost would become real. And tomorrow, for the first time in my life, Greg Walker would have to listen to me, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice, to understand the ice that filled my veins as I waited in that boardroom. You have to go back to a humid afternoon when I was 14 years old. I was not holding a smartphone or a tablet given to me as a birthday present. I was holding a refurbished laptop that weighed nearly 6 pounds. A machine I had bought with money earned from mowing lawns and scrubbing neighbors' gutters for an entire summer. It ran hot, the fan sounding like a dying jet engine. But to me, it was the most beautiful thing in the world, because it was the first thing that was truly mine. I had spent 3 months teaching myself Python from pirated PDFs and forums that took 5 minutes to load. I had built a functional inventory management application. It was ugly, a mess of gray buttons and Times New Roman font. But it worked. I had coded a logic system that could track groceries, predict expiration dates, and generate shopping lists. I thought I had performed magic. I thought I had created something from nothing. I walked down the stairs to the living room, the laptop burning my forearms. My father, Greg, was sitting in his leather armchair, the same one he treated like a throne, reviewing quarterly reports for Walker Systems. He was highlighting rows of data with a yellow marker. His brow furrowed in that serious, important way that signaled he was holding the world on his shoulders. "Dad," I said, my voice cracking with a mixture of pride and terror, "I made something." He did not look up immediately. He finished highlighting a row, capped the marker with a sharp click, and then finally turned his head. I set the heavy laptop on the coffee table and ran the script. I explained the logic, how the database updated, how I had debugged a loop that had kept crashing the system for a week. I spoke fast, my words tumbling over each other, desperate to convey the complexity of what I had solved. He looked at the screen for exactly 5 seconds. He did not read the code. He did not ask how I built it. He simply glanced at the gray interface, gave a short, distracted hum, and picked up his marker again. "That is nice, Juliana," he said, his eyes already drifting back to his paper reports. "Maybe you can use it to help your mother keep track of her knitting supplies." It was not a compliment. It was a dismissal so complete it felt physical. He did not see the logic or the architecture. He saw a toy. He saw a domestic triviality. I stood there, the blood draining from my face, feeling foolish for thinking I could impress a titan of industry with a few lines of code. Then came the second blow, the one that sealed the wound. My sister, Sarah, was sitting on the sofa, flipping through a fashion magazine. She was 2 years older, already groomed to be the heir, already fluent in the language of networking and corporate aesthetics. She looked over the top of her magazine, glanced at my clunky laptop, and smiled. "It is a cute hobby. Jules," she said, "cute." The word hung in the air like smoke. She did not mean to be cruel, which somehow made it worse. If she had been mean, I could have fought back. But she was patronizing. She was categorizing my passion, the thing that made my brain sing, as something adorable and temporary, like making friendship bracelets or baking cookies. To them, technology was something you bought or managed. It was not something you got your hands dirty with. Over the next 4 years, that dynamic calcified into a hard, unbreakable reality. I stopped showing them my code, but I did not stop working. I entered regional robotics competitions and took gold. I hacked into the school district network to expose a security flaw and was quietly thanked by the administration to avoid a scandal. I won a full scholarship to a prestigious engineering program 3 states away. In any other house, these would be cause for celebration. In the Walker household, they were items on a checklist, acknowledged with a distracted nod before the conversation shifted back to the real topic, Sarah. Dinner time was the stage where my father directed the play of our lives. We would sit around the mahogany table, the silence punctuated by the scrape of silverware. My father would hold court, asking Sarah about her business electives, her internship at his friend's firm, her thoughts on market trends. When Sarah spoke, he leaned in, he nodded, he validated her existence with his attention. He was molding her in his image, creating a mirror that reflected his own ego back at him. When it was my turn, the energy in the room died. "I heard you won that computer thing," he would say, cutting his steak. "That is good. It keeps you busy. Just make sure you do not neglect your social skills. You cannot run a company from behind a screen. Juliana, you have to learn to deal with people." He was telling me I was broken before I had even started. He was defining me as the back office technician, the socially inept introvert, the dreamer who needed to be managed by people like Sarah. I would look across the table at my mother. She was always there, eating in small, precise bites, her eyes fixed on her plate. She never joined in when my father lectured me, but she never stopped him either, for years. I resented her silence. I wanted her to slam her fist on the table and scream that I was brilliant. But as I got older, I saw the flinch in her shoulders when he raised his voice. I saw how she navigated the minefield of his moods. Her silence was not agreement. It was survival. She was a woman who had learned that in the Walker house. Speaking up just gave him a target. The most painful lesson I learned during those years was that cruelty does not require volume. We are taught that abuse is screaming, or hitting, or throwing things. But the deepest scars I carry came from the quiet moments. They came from the way my father would introduce us at company parties. "This is Sarah," he would say, his hand on her shoulder, beaming. "She is going to take over the world someday. She has the killer instinct." And then he would gesture vaguely toward me, standing awkwardly in the corner, "And this is Juliana. She likes computers." He made me feel small. He made my world, which was vast and infinite and filled with the beautiful logic of algorithms, feel like a closet. I tried so hard to prove him wrong. I thought if I just won a bigger award, if I just got a better grade, if I just built something undeniable, he would finally look at me and see a peer. But every time I brought him a victory, he found a way to shrink it. I built a website for a local charity that increased their donations by 200%. He asked why I did not charge them for it, calling it poor business sense. I got accepted into a summer program at a top tech firm. He asked if it was a diversity quota hire. He had a yardstick in his head, and no matter what I did, he ensured I never measured up. He moved the goalposts every time I got close. The breaking point did not happen with a bang. It happened on a Tuesday. 2 weeks before I left for college, I came home to find him in my room. Looking at the mess of wires and circuit boards on my desk, I thought, for one brief, foolish second, that he was taking an interest. "You need to clean this up," he said, not looking at me. "We are turning this room into a home office for Sarah when you leave. She needs the space to focus on her MBA prep." He was erasing me before I was even gone. That was the moment the switch flipped. I looked at his broad back, at the confident set of his shoulders, and I realized something that set me free. I realized I could never win his game because the game was rigged. He did not want me to succeed. He needed me to fail, or at least to be lesser, so that his narrative about Sarah and about himself remained true. If I was a genius, then he was wrong, and Greg Walker was never wrong. I stopped packing my clothes and started packing my equipment. I looked at him and said nothing. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply decided that I was done waiting for him to give me permission to be great. I was not going to prove myself to him anymore. I was going to take myself out of his equation entirely. I would not just leave his house. I would leave his atmosphere. I would build a world where his opinion held no currency, where his judgment had no jurisdiction. I would stop trying to measure up to his yardstick and instead build a rocket to fly over his head. Standing there in my room, listening to him talk about Sarah's future office, I made a vow to the 14-year-old girl who had been dismissed as a cute hobbyist. I vowed that the next time Greg Walker paid attention to my work, it would not be because he was doing me a favor. It would be because he had no other choice. And now, 12 years later, sitting in the silence of the obsidian room, I knew that the bill for all those dinners, all those dismissals, and all those silences had finally come due. The way I left home was not cinematic. There was no slamming of doors, no screaming matches in the driveway, and no dramatic rainstorm to wash away my tears. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the house was silent. I packed a single suitcase with my clothes, my laptop, and a few technical manuals. I had saved $4,000 from my freelance coding gigs, hidden in a hollowed-out biology textbook. I left a note on the kitchen counter that simply said I was moving out to be closer to campus. I did not ask for their blessing, and I did not wait for them to wake up and tell me I was making a mistake. I just unlocked the front door, stepped into the cool night air, and drove away. For the next 4 years, I lived like a monk, while my peers were rushing fraternities and spending their weekends at football tailgates. I was in the computer lab, subsisting on vending machine coffee and sheer willpower. I treated university not as an experience but as a transaction. I needed the knowledge, I needed the credentials, and I needed to build my portfolio. I took every internship I could get, from debugging legacy code for a local insurance firm to building firewalls for a logistics startup. I felt like a swimmer in the middle of the ocean at night. I could not see the shore. I could not see the bottom. All I could see was the patch of water directly in front of my face. So I just kept stroking. Stroke, breathe, stroke, breathe. If I stopped to look around at how far I had to go, I knew I would drown. Then came graduation day. It was supposed to be a milestone, the validation of 4 years of sleepless nights. I walked across the stage. The dean handed me my diploma, and I looked out into the sea of parents. My mother was there, waving a small white handkerchief, looking small and fragile in the bleachers. Next to her, the seat was empty. My father was not there. Later, I found out why. Sarah had a presentation for a potential mid-sized client, and she was nervous. He had skipped my college graduation to sit in a conference room and watch her read slides he had probably written for her. He chose her Tuesday afternoon meeting over the culmination of my academic life. He called me that evening. The background noise was loud, the clinking of glasses and laughter. They were celebrating Sarah's presentation. Good job on the degree, kiddo, he said, his voice breezy and distracted. Listen, I was talking to HR. We have an opening in the IT support team. It is mostly resetting passwords and fixing printers, but it is a foot in the door. I can pull some strings and get you an interview. I held the phone so tight I thought the plastic would crack. I had graduated summa cum laude. I had already built a predictive algorithm that was better than anything on the market, and he was offering me a job fixing printers. He still saw me as the help desk. He still saw me as the girl who cleaned up the mess, so the real business people could work. No thank you. Dad, I said, I have other plans. I hung up before he could tell me I was being ungrateful. That was the last time I asked him for anything. I moved to San Francisco the next week. The city was a beast that chewed up dreamers and spat them out, but it was the only place I could build what was in my head. I rented a studio apartment in the Tenderloin that was smaller than my father's walk-in closet. The rent was exorbitant, eating up almost all my savings. But I did not care. I spent my days working as a contract coder to pay the bills and my nights building Ether. I learned very quickly that in the venture capital world, meritocracy is a myth. I had the product. My code was elegant, scalable, and revolutionary. But I did not have the pedigree. I was a 22-year-old woman with no co-founder, no Stanford network, and no famous advisor. I walked into boardrooms and was asked whose assistant I was. I sent cold emails that vanished into the void. I was rejected by 34 investors in 3 months. They told me I needed a technical team. They told me I needed a track record. They told me, in so many words, that I did not look like a CEO. The lowest point came on a gray November afternoon. I had just been laughed out of a meeting on Sand Hill Road. The partner had actually checked his watch while I was demoing the core feature. I sat in my beat-up sedan in the parking lot, my head resting on the steering wheel, watching the rain streak the windshield. I had $12 in my bank account. Rent was due in 3 days. I was tired. A bone-deep exhaustion that made my hands shake. I thought about calling home. I thought about the printer repair job. It would be warm. It would be safe. It would mean admitting he was right. I opened my wallet and pulled out a small, cream-colored business card. My mother had slipped it into my hand the day I left for the city, checking over her shoulder to make sure my father wasn't watching. If you ever really need someone to listen. She had whispered, "He is an old friend. He owes me a favor." I had never called it because I wanted to do this alone, but staring at the rain, I realized that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. I dialed the number. A man answered on the second ring. His voice was gravelly, sharp. "This is Marcus," he said. I introduced myself. I told him who my mother was. There was a long silence on the other end, heavy with history I did not understand. "Meet me at the coffee shop on University Avenue in 20 minutes. He said, "You have 10 minutes. Do not be late." I drove like a maniac. I walked in, water dripping from my coat, and sat across from a man who looked like he had seen everything and was impressed by none of it. I opened my laptop. I did not use the pitch deck I had polished for months. I did not use buzzwords. I just showed him the engine. I showed him how Ether could process unstructured data 5 times faster than the current industry standard. I talked for 9 minutes. He watched me, his face unreadable. When I finished, I closed the laptop and waited for the rejection. He took a sip of his espresso. "How much do you need?" I blinked. 500,000 for a seed round. I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline crashing through my system. "I will give you 750, he said. "But I have one condition. Anything." I said. He leaned forward. "You drop the name. Walker is a hardware name. It is old guard. It represents heavy metal and slow decisions. You are building software. You are building the future. If you go out there as Juliana Walker, half the valley will think you are a nepotism baby, and the other half will think you are a spy for your father. You want to win. You win as Juliana. Just Juliana." I looked at him. He was asking me to erase my identity, but then I realized he was not asking me to erase it. He was asking me to liberate myself from it. "Done." I said. That check changed everything. We hired a team. We moved out of my apartment and into a real office. EtherLogic launched 6 months later. We did not just enter the market, we broke it. Our Series A funding round was oversubscribed. Our Series B valued us at $400 million. TechCrunch called me the prodigy of the new data age. Forbes put me on their list of disruptors. I worked 18 hours a day. I became obsessed with perfection. I was fueled by the memory of that empty chair at graduation. Every time we signed a new client, every time our stock valuation ticked upward, I felt a grim satisfaction. Meanwhile, in the South, Walker Systems was bleeding, and my father had no idea that the competitor eating into his market share, the mysterious female CEO everyone was talking about, was the same girl he had told to fix printers. I was growing a forest while he was busy watering a dying plant, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the watering can. I was no longer looking for the shore, I was building the island. The dawn light was just beginning to bruise the sky over San Francisco, turning the bay a dull, metallic gray, but inside the obsidian room, time had ceased to exist. We were operating on pure adrenaline and the artificial daylight of fluorescent strips. I had mobilized my strike team at 4 a.m. These were my best people: 3 financial analysts, 2 senior engineers, and my general counsel. They did not ask why we were dissecting a failing mid-sized hardware company from the South before sunrise. They simply saw the intensity in my eyes and opened their laptops. We were conducting due diligence at the speed of light. Usually, this process takes weeks. I needed it done in 6 hours. I paced the length of the conference table, watching the data populate on the wall-sized monitors. To my team, I was Juliana, the CEO, the predator circling a wounded animal, looking for value in the carcass. But inside, I was vibrating with a frequency that felt dangerous. I was fighting to keep the 14-year-old girl in the basement of my mind, locking her behind a firewall of professionalism every time the name Walker flashed on the screen. My pulse spiked. I had to physically unclench my hands to keep them from shaking. The financial report came first. It was a bloodbath. Their burn rate was unsustainable, and their debt-to-equity ratio was catastrophic. They were bleeding cash to keep a bloated executive structure afloat. I nodded, keeping my face impassive. This I expected. This was the leverage I needed. Then, the head of my engineering team cleared his throat. He was a brilliant, quiet man named David who rarely spoke unless he had found a critical bug. "Juliana," he said, projecting a schematic onto the main screen. "You need to see the architecture for their legacy server management software. It is their flagship product, the only thing currently generating recurring revenue." I stopped pacing and looked at the screen. The diagram was complex, a spiderweb of data ingestion nodes and processing logic. I squinted, tracing the flow of information from the user interface down to the kernel level. It looked efficient. It looked robust. It looked like my handwriting. The air left my lungs. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. I walked closer to the screen, my eyes tracing the specific way the load balancer distributed the requests. It was a unique configuration, a non-standard approach I had developed during my senior year of college for my capstone project. I had called it the Prism Protocol. I had spent 6 months coding it, fueled by energy drinks and the desperate need to create something perfect. I had left the prototype on the family home server before I moved out. Thinking nothing of it, it was just a college project. "That is not standard industry architecture," David said, sounding puzzled. "It is actually quite brilliant. It solves the latency issue by bypassing the central queue entirely, but the coding style, it feels disjointed from the rest of their stack, like someone took a Ferrari engine and duct-taped it into a tractor." I stared at the blue lines on the screen. My father had not just dismissed my talent, he had stolen it. He had taken the work of the daughter he called useless and built his company's survival on top of it. He had been selling my brain for 10 years while telling me I had no aptitude. The betrayal was not hot. It was ice cold. It settled in my stomach like a stone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the chair through the glass wall. But I was not just a daughter anymore. I was a CEO. and I had a room full of people watching me. "Dig deeper," I said. My voice was low, terrifyingly calm. "I want a forensic audit of that codebase. I want to see the metadata. I want to see the import logs. I want to know exactly when that core architecture was added to their repository and by whom. Do not sleep until you have it." David nodded, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, and began typing furiously. Just as I turned away from the screen, the phone in the center of the table buzzed. It was the priority line. My executive assistant's voice came through the speaker, tight with anxiety. "Juliana, I have 2 members of the board on the video link. They saw the alert about the potential acquisition talks. They are not happy." I closed my eyes for a second, inhaling deeply. Of course, the sharks in my own tank were waking up. I signaled for the team to keep working and stepped into the adjacent soundproof booth. Tapping the accept button on the tablet, 2 faces appeared on the screen, heavy hitters, venture capitalists who cared about quarterly growth. "Not family trauma, Juliana." One of them started without preamble. "Why are we allocating resources to Walker Systems? They are a dinosaur. Their tech stack is ancient. This looks like a charity mission, and we are not a nonprofit." I could not tell them the truth. I could not say, "I am doing this because my father stole my code and broke my heart." If I made this personal, they would remove me. They would see me as unstable, emotional, a liability. I had to speak their language. I had to lie with the truth. "It is not a charity mission," I said, my voice sharp and authoritative. "It is a strategic harvest. Walker Systems has a client list of 300 Fortune 500 companies locked into long-term hardware contracts. Those clients are currently stuck on legacy systems. If we acquire Walker, we do not just get their failing tech, we get their Rolodex. We can migrate those 300 clients to Ether's cloud platform within 6 months. The acquisition cost is a fraction of what we would spend on marketing to acquire those same customers individually." I paused, letting the logic sink in. I was selling them a Trojan horse. Plus, I added, improvising. Their patent portfolio has some defensive value against upcoming antitrust regulations. It is a shield and a sword. The board members exchanged a look. The tension on the screen dissipated slightly. The math worked. The emotion was absent. "Fine," the second one said, "but do not overpay. And do not let this distract from the Q3 product launch. You have a long leash. Juliana. But do not hang yourself with it." The screen went black. I leaned against the glass wall, exhaling a breath I felt I had been holding for an hour. I had bought myself time, but the pressure was mounting. I was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against my past, and one to protect my future. I stepped back into the war room, ready to push the team harder. When my general counsel looked up from her laptop, her face was pale. "Juliana, we have a problem." "What now?" I asked. "Market chatter," she said, turning her screen toward me. "There is a leak. Someone knows Walker Systems is in play. I am seeing movement from Omnicorp. Omnicorp, our biggest rival, a behemoth that crushed smaller companies for sport. If they sniffed blood in the water, they would not care about the tech or the backstory. They would just buy Walker Systems to keep me from having it. They would offer a cash buyout, strip the assets, and bury the company and the evidence of the stolen code forever if Omnicorp got involved. My father would take their money. He would see a golden parachute and pull the ripcord, escaping without ever having to face me. He would win. Again. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. This was no longer just a meeting. It was no longer just a family reckoning. This was corporate warfare. I had to lock this deal down before the sun went down, or I would lose everything. "Get me the legal team drafting an exclusivity agreement," I ordered, my voice ringing through the room, "and find out where the leak came from. If someone inside this building is talking, I want them gone by noon." I looked back at the schematic on the wall, my code. Trapped inside his machine, the stakes had just multiplied. I was not just fighting for an apology anymore. I was fighting for ownership of my own mind. And I would burn the building down before I let him sell it to someone else. At exactly 10 o'clock. The heavy glass doors of the obsidian room swung open. My executive assistant held the door, and Greg Walker walked in. He looked exactly as the magazines pictured him, perhaps with a little more gray at the temples. But he wore his authority like a tailored suit. He strode across the plush carpet with the confident, long gait of a man who owned every room he entered. He did not look like a man on the brink of ruin. He looked like a man coming to bestow a favor. He reached the head of the table where I stood, my back to the panoramic view of the city. He extended his hand. "Greg Walker," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that I had heard in my nightmares for a decade. "It is a pleasure to finally meet the mind behind ether logic." I took his hand. It was dry and firm. The grip was practiced strong enough to assert dominance, brief enough to be professional. I looked him directly in the eyes. They were the same steel-gray eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. I waited for the spark, the widening of pupils, the sudden intake of breath that would signal recognition. There was nothing. He looked at me and saw a stranger. He saw a potential investor. He saw a checkbook. He did not see the daughter whose height he had measured against the kitchen doorframe for 18 years. To him, I was just another face in the landscape of his career. Behind him came Sarah. She was wearing a sharp navy blazer and heels that clicked rhythmically against the floor. She looked exhausted beneath her impeccable makeup, her posture rigid with the tension of keeping a sinking ship afloat. She moved to shake my hand, and for a split second, she paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly as they swept over my face. There was a glitch in her processing, a moment of déjà vu where the geometry of my cheekbones or the curve of my mouth triggered a memory. But she blinked, and the moment vanished. I was the CEO of a billion-dollar company. Her sister was a dropout who fixed computers. The logic did not compute, so she discarded the data. "Sarah Walker, VP of Product," she said, her smile tight. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice. Please, sit," I said. My voice was calm, lowered an octave to match the acoustics of the room. I gestured to the chairs on the opposite side of the mahogany table. I remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, forcing them to look up at me, before I took my seat. The presentation began. It was a masterclass in corporate theater. My father stood at the head of the room, clicking through slides that were beautiful, sleek, and utterly dishonest. He spoke about Walker Systems as if it were a sleeping giant ready to wake, rather than a dinosaur choking on the ash of a changing world. "We are facing some temporary liquidity headwinds," he said, using the polite term for being broke. "However, our core technology remains the industry standard. We are looking for a strategic partner to help us unlock the next phase of our synergy." He used words like robust and legacy and market penetration. He skipped over the 42% drop in revenue. He glossed over the client attrition. He painted a picture of a company that was merely stumbling, not falling off a cliff. I sat in my chair, perfectly still. I had a notepad in front of me and a silver pen in my hand. I did not nod. I did not smile. I did not offer encouraging sounds. I just wrote. Every time he made a dubious claim, I made a mark. Every time he used a buzzword to cover a failure, I made a mark. It felt eerily familiar. I was back at the dinner table, listening to him pontificate about his day, knowing that my role was to be the silent audience, but the power dynamic had inverted. Back then, my silence was a requirement of my submission. Now, my silence was the loudest thing in the room. I could see it unnerving him. He paused a fraction of a second too long between sentences. He glanced at Sarah, looking for reassurance. He was used to dazzling people, to charming them into agreement. My lack of reaction was a void he could not fill. Sarah took over for the technical portion. She spoke confidently, but I could hear the rehearsal in her voice. She was reciting lines she had memorized, not concepts she understood. She pointed to the architecture diagram, the stolen architecture, and called it a proprietary innovation of the Walker engineering team. I wrote harder, the pen digging into the paper. When they finished, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating quiet. The projector hummed. My father stood there, his chest heaving slightly from the effort of the performance. A hopeful smile plastered on his face. He expected questions. He expected me to ask about valuation or timelines. I let the silence stretch. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. My father shifted his weight. Sarah cleared her throat, reaching for her water glass. They were sweating. Finally, I closed my notebook with a snap that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. I stood up. I walked slowly to the whiteboard behind me, picking up a black marker. I did not look at them. I drew a single, sharp line down the center of the board. Your client acquisition cost has risen by 200% in 18 months. I said, my back to them. Your churn rate is higher than your intake, and your flagship product, the one you just called an innovation, is running on code that was written over a decade ago. I turned around to face them. My father's smile had faltered. He looked confused, defensive. We have a legacy code base. Yes, he said, his tone sharpening. But it is stable. It is the bedrock of— It is not a bedrock, I interrupted, my voice cutting through his like a scalpel. It is a capstone project, he blinked. Excuse me. I took a step closer to the table. I walked until I was standing directly across from him, my hands resting on the leather back of an empty chair. The architecture you are using, I said, keeping my eyes locked on his. The load balancing protocol. It was not developed by your engineering team. It was built on a refurbished Gateway laptop in a living room at 42 Maple Drive. The color drained from Sarah's face. Her hand froze halfway to her mouth. She knew the address. My father frowned, a deep crease appearing between his eyebrows. He looked like a man trying to read a map in a foreign language. I do not know what you are talking about, he said, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. That is our private residence. How would you? I continued, ignoring him. It was built by a 14-year-old girl who was trying to show her father that she understood the logic of his world. She brought it to him while he was highlighting reports with a yellow marker. She showed him the code, and he told her it was a cute hobby. The room went absolutely still. The air conditioning seemed to stop. The hum of the projector vanished. My father stared at me. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at my eyes, really looked at them, and for the first time. He saw past the expensive haircut and the tailored suit. He saw the anger. He saw the hurt. He saw the history. Sarah let out a small, strangled gasp. Oh my God, she whispered. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. You walked in here thinking you were pitching a stranger. Greg, I said, you thought you could sell me a stolen engine and call it a new car. But you forgot one variable. You forgot that the girl you dismissed as background noise was the one writing the script. I straightened up, towering over him as he sat slumped in his chair. My name is not just Juliana. I said, my name is Juliana Walker, and I am the one holding the gavel now. My father looked as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He collapsed back against the chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The confident CEO vanished. The arrogance evaporated. In his place was a terrified old man who realized that the ground beneath his feet had just turned into a trapdoor, and the person holding the lever was the one person he had never feared. The silence in the conference room after my revelation was heavy. But the silence in my private office an hour later was suffocating. I had sent my father and Sarah back to their hotel to process the reality of their situation. I told them we would reconvene in the morning. I needed them out of my sight because my engineering team had just sent the final forensic report, and the contents made me want to burn the building down. David walked in, holding a tablet like it was a loaded weapon. He did not sit down. He simply placed the device on my desk and slid it toward me. We found the root directory, he said, his voice stripped of any professional detachment. He sounded angry on my behalf. It was not just a copy-paste job. Juliana? It was a drag and drop. I looked at the screen. The forensic audit had peeled back the layers of the Walker Systems flagship software, stripping away the user interface and the branding to reveal the skeleton underneath. And there, buried deep in the source code, was a file path that had been commented out but never deleted. It was a lazy, arrogant mistake. The kind made by someone who never imagined anyone would look under the hood. The directory path read c/users/greg/documents/jules_uni_project/source. I stared at the text. Jules. He hadn't even bothered to rename the folder. He did not write this code. David continued, pointing to a block of logic on the screen. He imported it. We found the metadata tags. The original creation dates correspond exactly to the spring semester of your senior year. All he did was wrap a new graphical interface around it and change a few variable names. He took your engine and put a different coat of paint on the hood. I scrolled through the comparison. On the left was my original code, the logic I had agonized over in my dorm room, fueled by cheap coffee and the desperate need to prove myself. On the right was the Walker Systems product. They were 98% identical, the logic flows for data retrieval, the predictive caching algorithms, the security handshake protocols. It was all mine. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. For 10 years, I had carried the wound of his rejection. I had built my entire identity around the narrative that my father thought I was talentless. I believed he ignored my work because he didn't understand it, or because he didn't respect it. But I was wrong. He hadn't ignored it. He had recognized its value immediately. He knew I was brilliant. He knew my code was better than anything his expensive engineering team could produce. But instead of praising me, instead of bringing me into the fold, he had crushed my confidence to keep me docile while he stole the fruits of my labor. He had looked me in the eye, told me I had no future in tech, and then turned around and saved his company using my invention. It was not just neglect, it was predation. He had cannibalized his own daughter to feed his ego. I sat back in my chair, a cold, hard rage settling in my chest. This changed everything. This was no longer a negotiation about a partnership. This was a crime scene. I could call the lawyers right now. I could file an intellectual property lawsuit that would not just bankrupt Walker Systems, but would humiliate my father on a national stage. I could prove he was a fraud. I could strip him of his company, his reputation, and his legacy in a single afternoon. My finger hovered over the intercom button. It would be so easy. It would be the ultimate vindication. But then my eyes drifted to the personnel file included in the due diligence report. 142 employees. I saw names, faces, tenures, Betty in accounting, who had been there for 20 years, Marcus in logistics, who had 3 kids on the company health plan, the junior developers who had just started their careers. If I pulled the trigger on a lawsuit, the company would implode. The assets would be frozen. The reputation destroyed. My father would be ruined. Yes, but so would 142 innocent people who had nothing to do with his lies. I was trapped. My father had unintentionally used his employees as human shields. If I destroyed him, I destroyed them. I stood up and walked to the window. Looking down at the traffic crawling along the street below, this was the difference between us. I realized he viewed people as resources to be exploited. I viewed them as responsibilities. If I burned him down now, I would be just as destructive as he was. I turned back to David. "Archive this report," I said, my voice steady. "Encrypt it. Store it on a standalone drive. No one sees this but me." "You are not going to use it?" David asked, stunned. "Juliana, this is theft. Grand larceny. I am not going to use it yet." I corrected him. "This is not a weapon for destruction. It is an insurance policy. It is the bullet I will keep in the chamber. If he tries to fight me, if he tries to deny me, or if he tries to hurt this company, I will pull it out, but not today." David nodded slowly, understanding the play, and left the room. I sat alone with the secret. I felt heavy, burdened by the truth, but also strangely powerful. He thought he was negotiating with a wealthy stranger. He did not know he was negotiating with the owner of his own foundation, but the day was not done with me yet. Just as I locked the drive in my safe, my head of security, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena, buzzed in. "We have a situation on the network," she said, her voice tight. I rubbed my temples. "What is it?" We are monitoring the outbound traffic from the Walker Systems team, as you requested. She said, "We found a leak. Someone is sending encrypted data packets to an external server. We traced the IP address. Let me guess." I said, "Omnicorp." "Confirmed," she replied. "But that is not the worst part. The data is not just financial summaries. It is specific. Tactical information, meeting notes, your psychological profile, the exact terms of the deal you are drafting. Someone is not just leaking data, they are providing a playbook on how to kill this deal." I frowned. It made no sense for my father to leak this. He was desperate. He needed this partnership to survive. If Omnicorp got involved, they would dismantle his legacy, and he knew it. He wanted a savior, not a butcher. "Who is sending it?" I asked. "The encryption is high level," Elena said. "It is using a proxy to bounce the signal. But whoever it is, they are doing it from inside the building. They are using a guest login credential that was assigned to the Walker executive team this morning." I stared at the wall. A traitor. There was a snake in the grass. Someone who sat in that boardroom and smiled at me while sliding a knife between my ribs. Someone who wanted this deal to fail. Even if it meant the end of the company. Who hates me enough to burn the lifeboat, or who is greedy enough to sell the wreckage. "Keep tracking it." I ordered, "Do not block the transmission yet. I want to see what they are sending. I want to know exactly how much they are worth to the opposition." I leaned back, the adrenaline turning into a cold focus. My father had stolen my past, but someone else was trying to steal my future. The reunion was over. The investigation had begun. And I was going to find out who was betraying whom, even if I had to tear the family tree apart branch by branch to find the rot. The data stream was a faint pulse on the monitor, a rhythmic heartbeat of information bleeding out of our secure environment. It was subtle. Most security protocols would have missed it because it was not a massive dump of files. It was a drip feed, timed to look like standard background noise or automated cloud backups. But Elena, my head of security, did not believe in background noise. She isolated the frequency and projected it onto the main screen of the war room. "It is encrypted," she said, pointing to the scrolling lines of hex code. "But we cracked the handshake. It is a direct line to a server in Nevada. That server is a known dead drop for Omnicorp's competitive intelligence unit." I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. They were not just stealing financial data, they were stealing the roadmap. I saw files listed that contained our due diligence findings, our valuation models, and, most damning of all, the strategic weaknesses of Walker Systems that my team had just uncovered. Whoever was sending this was handing Omnicorp a loaded gun. They were giving our rival exactly enough ammunition to craft a counteroffer that would kill my deal, dismantle the company, and leave me with nothing. "Trace the source," I said, my voice cold. Elena typed a command. The screen shifted, narrowing down the network topology until it locked onto a single device. A red dot pulsed on the floor plan of the building. Device ID matches an iPad Pro registered to the executive guest network. Elena said, "The user login is S. Walker exec. Sarah." The room seemed to tilt. My sister, the one who had smiled at me across the dinner table for years while calling my passion a cute hobby, the one who was currently sitting in a hotel room I had paid for, supposedly preparing to save her father's legacy. She was selling us out. But then Elena frowned. "Wait, the routing is strange. She is not sending it directly to Omnicorp. That would be too clumsy. She is bouncing it through a middleman, a private consulting firm based in D.C. It is a laundering operation for information. She is trying to scrub her digital fingerprints. This was not a panic move. This was premeditated. It was a calculated betrayal designed to look like a corporate leak." I felt a surge of nausea, followed immediately by a hardening of my resolve. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I turned to my assistant. "Get Sarah on the phone." I said, "Tell her I need to clarify a detail about the product roadmap. Tell her to come alone. No lawyers, no father, just her. Tell her to meet me in the Sky Lounge in 20 minutes. The Sky Lounge was a small, glass-walled observation deck on the top floor of our building. It was quiet, isolated, and offered a view of the city that made human problems feel insignificant. I was waiting there when the elevator doors slid open. Sarah walked in. She had changed out of her travel clothes into a fresh suit. Her hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. She looked every inch the capable executive, but I saw the tightness in her jaw. I saw the way her fingers twitched against the strap of her bag. "Juliana," she said, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Dad is resting. I hope this won't take long. We are all exhausted." I did not smile back. I was sitting on a low sofa, a manila folder resting on the coffee table in front of me. "Sit down, Sarah." She paused, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The air in the room was heavy, charged with the static of things unsaid. She sat on the edge of the chair opposite me, crossing her legs defensively. "What is this about?" she asked. I reached forward and slid the folder toward her. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a log of the data packets leaving her device, the timestamp, the IP address of the middleman, and the final destination at Omnicorp. "You are good," I said, my voice conversational, almost admiring. Routing it through a DC consultant was a smart touch. It almost worked. "But you forgot that you are on my network. And on my network, nothing moves without my permission." Sarah looked down at the paper. She read the lines of code. Her face went pale, then red. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. But she tried to hold her ground. "I do not know what this is." She stammered, I must have been hacked. You know how insecure hotel Wi-Fi can be. Someone must have mirrored my device." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Stop it," I said. "Just stop. I am not Dad. You cannot dazzle me with buzzwords, and you cannot lie to me about technology. That device has a biometric lock. You used your fingerprint to authorize the transfer." I watched the fight drain out of her. Her shoulders slumped. The perfect executive facade cracked, and for the first time in years, I saw the person underneath. She looked small. She looked terrified. Why, I asked. Why burn the deal? "Sarah, if Omnicorp buys the company, they will chop it up for parts. The brand disappears. Dad's legacy disappears. You lose your job. Why would you help the enemy destroy your own house?" She stared at the floor for a long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, filled with a mixture of anger and desperate exhaustion. "Because if you save the company, I am trapped," she whispered. I frowned, confused. "What if this deal goes through?" she said, her voice rising, becoming shrill. "We survive. Dad stays the chairman. I stay the VP of product, and I have to keep pretending. I have to keep waking up every morning and acting like I know what I'm doing." She stood up, pacing the small room, her hands gesturing wildly. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to be the heir? Dad put that crown on me when I was 16. He decided I was the business genius. He decided I was the one who would carry the name. But I am not you. Juliana, I do not see the code. I do not see the future. I am a fraud. I have been drowning for 10 years. Every meeting, every board presentation, I am terrified someone is going to ask me a question I cannot answer." She stopped and looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "If Omnicorp buys us, it is over. The company dies. Dad is forced to retire. And I get a severance package, and I get to walk away. I get to be free. I get to stop being Greg Walker's disappointment." I sat there, stunned. I had spent my entire life resenting her. I thought she was the princess in the tower, eating the feasts while I starved in the dungeon. But I was wrong. She wasn't the princess. She was the prisoner. My father had neglected me. Yes, and that was a form of abuse. But he had suffocated her. He had forced her into a mold that did not fit, demanding she be a genius she wasn't, crushing her under the weight of his own ego. She tried to kill the company not out of greed, but out of a desperate need to escape him. I looked at her. Really looked at her, and the anger in my chest cooled into something tragic. We were both victims of the same man's narcissism. He had broken us both, just in different ways, but empathy is not absolution. I stood up and walked over to her. She flinched, expecting me to yell. Instead, I handed her a tissue from the side table. "I understand," I said quietly. "I really do." She looked at me, hope flickering in her eyes. "So, you will let it go? You will let the Omnicorp deal happen?" My face hardened. "No," I said. "I built this company on reality. Sarah. And the reality is, you just committed corporate espionage. You tried to sell out 140 employees who depend on their paychecks just so you could find an easy exit. You do not get to burn down the village just because you hate the mayor." She froze. "What are you going to do?" I walked back to the table and picked up the folder. "I am going to save the company," I said, "and you are going to help me. You are going to sign the papers tomorrow. You are going to smile, and when the ink is dry, you are going to resign." "Resign," she whispered. "Yes," I said. "You want out. I am giving you out. But you do not get the golden parachute. You do not get the victory lap. You leave quietly. You go find out who you actually are when you are not pretending to be Dad's clone. And if you ever try to sabotage me again, this folder goes to the FBI." Sarah looked at me, trembling. She saw the steel in my eyes. She realized that the little sister she used to pity had become the most powerful person in her world. "Okay," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "Okay." She turned to leave, her hand on the door handle. "Sarah," I called out. She looked back. "He did not win." I said, "Neither of us let him win." She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and slipped out the door. I stood alone in the glass box. Looking out at the city, the betrayal had been neutralized, but the victory felt hollow. I had disarmed my sister, but the real enemy, the man who had set us against each other, was still waiting for me in the morning, and I still had one more secret to uncover before the end. I thought I had drained the poison from the wound. I thought confronting Sarah and uncovering the theft of my code was the absolute floor of my family's dysfunction. I was sitting in my office, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and white, feeling the hollow victory of having cornered my own sister. When the elevator chime broke the silence, it was almost midnight. Security should have locked the floor. I turned around, expecting David or perhaps a lawyer with more bad news. Instead, I saw a woman standing in the glass archway. She was wearing a raincoat that looked too big for her shrinking frame. Clutching a canvas tote bag against her chest, it was my mother. She looked out of place in the sterile, chrome and glass aesthetic of Ether Logic. She belonged in the soft, muted corners of the house on Maple Drive, blending into the wallpaper. In all the years I had been gone, she had never visited. She had never called, except for brief, stilted birthday wishes that sounded monitored. "Mom," I asked. Standing up, my voice was softer than I intended. She walked into the room, her steps tentative. She did not hug me. We were not a hugging family. That language had been lost long ago. She simply walked to my desk and placed the tote bag on the polished surface. "I told Greg I was going to the pharmacy," she said. Her voice was steady, clearer than I remembered. It was the first time I had heard her say his name without looking to see if he was listening. She reached into the bag and pulled out a wooden box. It was an old cigar box my father used to keep loose change in. She slid it across the desk toward me. I opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, envelopes addressed to Juliana Walker, San Francisco. The handwriting was my mother's looping, careful script. I picked one up. The postmark was from 7 years ago. I picked up another, 5 years ago. "I never got these," I said, my throat tight. "I know," she replied. "I found them in his bottom drawer in the study. He told me he was mailing them for me. He said he wanted to save me the trip to the post office." She looked at me, her eyes dry but full of an ancient, quiet pain. "He never sent them, Juliana, and he never gave me the ones you sent. He told me you were too busy. He told me you had moved on and did not want to be bothered by your mother's nagging. He curated the silence between us. He wanted us to be strangers because if we talked, we might compare notes. I stared at the stack of envelopes. It was a physical manifestation of a decade of stolen connection. I had spent years thinking she was complicit in his neglect, that she had chosen his side by default. I had hardened my heart against her indifference, but she hadn't been indifferent. She had been silenced. It was a cruelty far more sophisticated than simple shouting. It was an architectural isolation. "There is more," she said. She reached into the box again and pulled out a small, silver USB drive. It was an old model, the casing scratched and worn. She placed it on top of the letters. "The night you left," she said, looking at the drive. "I went into your room. I knew you were gone for good. I saw your backup server running. I didn't know what it was doing, but I knew it was important to you. So I copied the directory. I didn't understand the code, Juliana, but I understood the look on your father's face when he stared at your screen. It was the look of a man who found a diamond in his own backyard and decided to claim it." I plugged the drive into my laptop. The folder popped up, project_prism_V1. It was the smoking gun. It was the original source code, time-stamped and dated the day I left home. "I kept it," she said, "for 10 years. I kept it in my jewelry box under the lining. I knew one day he would try to erase you. I wanted to make sure you could write yourself back in." I looked up at her, tears finally blurring my vision. The image of my mother, the woman I thought was weak, sneaking into my room to save my legacy, hiding evidence under her necklaces for a decade. It shattered me. Why, I asked. Why now? "Because I am tired," she said simply, "and because you need to know the rest." She took a deep breath. "The investor," she said. "Marcus." I froze. "What about him? You didn't just get lucky. Jules, the world doesn't work like that for people like us." I called him. My mind raced back to that rainy afternoon in the parking lot. The desperation, the miraculous meeting. I used the emergency phone in the laundry room so Greg wouldn't see the call log. She continued, "Marcus was in love with me 30 years ago, before I chose your father. It was the only card I had left to play. I told him my daughter was in the city, that she was brilliant, and that she was going to break if someone didn't give her a chance. I begged him to take the meeting. I told him it was the only favor I would ever ask." I sat back in my chair. The wind knocked out of me. My narrative, the story of the lone wolf, the self-made CEO who pulled herself up by her bootstraps, was a lie. Or at least, it was incomplete. I hadn't done it alone. I had been carried, quietly and invisibly, by a woman who had no power of her own but used every scrap of influence she had to build a bridge for me. I felt the wall I had built around my heart crumble. I wasn't the unloved daughter casting off her family. I was the daughter who had been loved so fiercely that her mother had betrayed her husband to save her. She did not ask me to stop. She did not say, "Please don't hurt your father," or "Please save the company." She just stood there, her hands clasping the empty tote bag. "You have the truth now," she said. "The letters, the code, the money. It is all there. You can use it to destroy him. God knows he deserves it. Or you can use it to do something else. But whatever you choose, do it because it is what you want, not because you are reacting to him. Do not let him control you with anger the way he controlled me with silence." She turned to leave. "Mom," I called out. She stopped. "Thank you," I whispered. She gave me a small, sad smile, the first real smile I had seen on her face in 20 years. "You were always the strong one, Juliana, even when you were small." She walked out, leaving me alone with the box of letters and the weight of the truth. I sat there for a long time. The anger that had fueled me for the last 24 hours was gone, replaced by a clarity that felt sharp and cool. Destroying the company would be easy. I could crush my father. I could watch him beg. But if I did that, I would be destroying the pension of the woman who sat at the front desk. I would be firing the engineers who had nothing to do with the theft. And I would be proving my father right, that power is only for hurting people. My mother hadn't saved the code so I could use it as a weapon. She had saved it so I could have a choice. I reached for the phone and dialed David. It was 1 in the morning, but he answered on the first ring. "We are changing the strategy." I said. "Are we pulling out?" he asked. "No," I said. "We are going in." "But the terms have changed. We are not just acquiring them. We are restructuring the entire deal. Draft a new term sheet. I want full operational control. I want the board seats. And I want a specific clause regarding the transition of executive power." There was a pause on the line. "What about the price?" "The price is the same," I said, "but the cost is going to be different. I am not coming to conquer. David, I am coming to clean house." I hung up the phone. I looked at the box of letters one last time, then closed the lid. I wasn't doing this for Greg Walker. I wasn't even doing it for Juliana Walker. I was doing it for the woman who had waited 10 years to send a letter, and for the girl who had unknowingly built a future on a borrowed laptop. The war was over. Now, the governance began. The following morning, the Obsidian Room did not look like a place of business. It looked like an execution chamber sanitized by air conditioning and expensive bottled water. I arrived 5 minutes early, placing a single, thick document in the center of the table. There were no pitch decks today. There were no projectors. There was only the term sheet, bound in black, sitting there like a verdict, when my father, Sarah, and their general counsel, a man named Miller who wore a suit that cost more than my first car, walked in. They looked like people marching to the gallows. My father's swagger was gone, replaced by a gray, shaky fatigue. Sarah looked pale, her eyes rimmed with red, avoiding my gaze. Miller, however, still had the glint of a man who thought he could negotiate his way out of a burning building. "Please, sit," I said. I did not stand up to greet them. They sat. I waited for the rustling of fabric to stop before I began. "The document in front of you is a binding merger agreement," I said, my voice flat and devoid of inflection. "It is not a draft. It is not a proposal. It is a final offer. You have 1 hour to review it, and then we sign." Miller leaned forward, his smile oily and patronizing. "Now, Juliana," he started. "Let's not be hasty. Mergers of this size usually take weeks of read the terms." "Arthur," I cut him off. "Then tell me if you think you have weeks." They opened the binders. I watched their eyes scan the pages. I saw the moment they reached Section 1 Employee Retention and Compensation. "I am acquiring the workforce, not just the assets," I explained. "Every single employee currently on the Walker Systems payroll will be retained for a minimum of 24 months. Their stock options, which are currently worthless thanks to your mismanagement, will be converted into EtherLogic equity at a 1-to-1 ratio. Their healthcare plans will be upgraded to our tier." My father looked up, confusion warring with relief. "You are keeping them, all of them I am." I said, "Because unlike you, Greg, I do not view people as disposable overhead. I view them as the engine. They did not break this company. You did. So they will not be the ones paying the price." He swallowed hard, looking down at the table. It was a mercy he did not expect, and it shamed him more than cruelty would have. Then came Section 2 Executive Restructuring. Miller read it and choked. "This says, immediate resignation." He sputtered. "For the CEO and the chairman, no golden parachute, no consulting retainer, just a buyout of his existing shares at current market value." He looked at me, incredulous. "Juliana, this is a hostile takeover. You cannot just strip the founder of his title. Greg built this place. We will need a transition period. A legacy role." "There is no legacy," I said, my voice hardening. "The legacy is a lie." I looked directly at my father. Clause 4, A is non-negotiable. "Greg, you are not transitioning. You are retiring. You will step down from the board. You will surrender your voting rights. And you will vacate your office by Friday. You will not have a ceremonial title. You will not come to the holiday parties. You are done." My father's face flushed a deep, angry red. His ego, battered as it was, tried to rear its head one last time. "You cannot do this," he growled, slamming his hand on the table. "I am Walker Systems. The clients know me. The market knows me. If you cut me out. The stock tanks. I will not sign a suicide note. I stayed perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out a slim, black folder. I placed it on top of the contract. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. He stared at the folder. He didn't answer, but I saw the recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly what was inside. "This is the forensic audit of your flagship product's source code," I said. "It contains the side-by-side comparison of the engine you are selling and the project I wrote in college. It traces the import logs. It proves, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, that the intellectual property foundation of your entire company belongs to me." Miller looked from me to my father. Sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, "What is she talking about?" "Greg, if you do not sign that resignation," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my father, "I will not just walk away from this deal. I will file a lawsuit for IP theft and fraud. I will release this report to the trade press. I will make sure every client you have knows that you have been selling stolen goods for a decade. You won't just lose the company, Dad. You will lose your reputation. You will lose your standing. You might even lose your freedom." My father seemed to shrink in his chair. The fight went out of him like air leaving a balloon. He looked at the black folder as if it were radioactive. He realized then that I wasn't just a bitter daughter. I was a superior strategist. I had brought a gun to a knife fight, and I had the safety off. Miller, realizing his client was compromised, tried a different angle. He turned to me, his eyes narrowing. "Fine," he said. "If Greg is out, we have to talk about the valuation. We have other interests. Juliana, Omnicorp has expressed significant interest. If you push too hard, we will walk across the street and sell to them. They are offering cash." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. I had been waiting for this. "You mean the interest generated by the data leak?" I asked. Miller froze. Sarah flinched, staring at her hands. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the back of the black folder and slid it toward Miller. "We tracked the encrypted packets leaving your network." I said, "We know about the leak to the DC consulting firm. We know the exact counteroffer Omnicorp is preparing based on that stolen data." I leaned forward. "Here is the problem, Arthur. That is corporate espionage. Since Sarah used company devices to transmit proprietary data to a competitor during an active due diligence phase, any deal you sign with Omnicorp right now is fruit of the poisonous tree. If you try to sell to them, I will report the leak to the SEC. I will tie this company up in litigation for 5 years. By the time the courts are done, there will be nothing left to sell." Miller looked at the paper, then at Sarah, who was trembling. He realized he was checkmated. He had no leverage. He had no backup plan. The Omnicorp deal was a trap, and I had just sprung it. The room went silent. It was the silence of a tomb. I turned to Sarah. "Section 3, I said softly. She looked up, terrified. "You resign as VP of Product," I said, "but you do not leave empty-handed. I am setting up a venture fund for female founders. You will manage the intake, you will not touch the code, and you will not touch the strategy. You will find people like I was people who are ignored, and you will give them a voice. It is a lower salary, it is less prestige, but it is honest work." Sarah looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. She understood. I wasn't destroying her. I was giving her a path to redemption. I was giving her the chance to be the person she actually was, rather than the person our father wanted her to be. I pushed the pen toward the center of the table. "The offer expires in 3 minutes. I said. My father looked at the contract. He looked at the black folder that held his darkest secret. He looked at the daughter he had underestimated for 20 years. His hand shook as he reached for the pen. He didn't say a word. He didn't apologize. He just signed his name on the line that ended his reign. He slid the paper to Sarah. She signed quickly, a sob escaping her throat. Then Miller, defeated and pale, added his witness signature. I took the document back. I checked the signatures. They were valid. "It is done," I said. I stood up. I picked up the black folder, the evidence that could have destroyed him, and I put it back in my briefcase. I would never release it. I didn't need to. The threat was enough. I looked at the three of them sitting there, stripped of their pretenses. "You can go now," I said. They stood up and walked out of the room. My father walked slowly, leaning heavily on the table for support. A king who had lost his crown. He didn't look back. I was left alone in the boardroom. The air felt lighter. The ghosts that had haunted me since I was 14 were gone. Banished not by screaming matches or dramatic tears, but by clauses, subsections, and the wet ink of a signature. I had not taken revenge. I had taken control, and for the first time in my life, the name Walker meant exactly what I wanted it to mean. The lawyers had vacated the room, taking their leather briefcases and their billable hours with them. Sarah had left, walking out with a strange mixture of grief and relief, like a prisoner stepping into the sunlight after a 10-year sentence, but I had asked my father to stay. There was one final piece of business that could not be transacted in front of witnesses. He sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The signature on the resignation papers was still wet, marking the end of the Walker Systems era. He looked at his hands, stripped of the power that had defined his existence for 40 years. I reached into my bag and pulled out the black folder. I had threatened him with it, used it as a sword to force his surrender, but I had never actually shown him the contents. I slid it down the length of the table. It stopped inches from his hands. "Open it," I said. He looked at me, weary. "Juliana," I signed. "It is over. Why do we have to—" "Because you need to see it," I interrupted, my voice quiet but unyielding. "You need to see that I know, not just about the mismanagement, not just about the debt. I know about the theft." He opened the folder. He stared at the side-by-side code comparison, the timestamps, the undeniable proof of his larceny. He saw the forensic evidence of the moment he decided to steal his daughter's mind to save his own reputation. "I did not do it to hurt you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No," I said. "You did it because you were afraid." He looked up, startled by the accusation. "You watched me build that engine on a laptop I bought with lawn mowing money." I continued, walking slowly toward him, "and you were terrified. You saw a 14-year-old girl doing something you could not do. You saw your own obsolescence staring back at you from a cracked screen. So you pushed me away. You told me I had no talent because if you admitted I was good, you had to admit you were average." He slumped in his chair, the truth hitting him harder than any lawsuit could. He closed his eyes, and a single tear leaked out, tracking through the deep lines of his face. "I wanted to be the giant," he confessed, his voice barely audible. "I wanted you to look up to me, but every time you opened your mouth, every time you wrote a line of code, I felt like I was shrinking. I stole it because it was the only way I could keep the lights on, the only way I could keep being the great Greg Walker. I used the thing I feared to keep myself alive." It was a pathetic confession, but it was the first honest thing he had said to me in my entire life. He was not a monster. He was just a man with a fragile ego who had sacrificed his family to protect his vanity. I took the folder back and closed it. "I am not going to release this," I said. "I am not going to destroy your reputation. The world can keep thinking you retired for health reasons." He looked at me, hope flickering in his eyes. "You forgive me." I shook my head slowly. "No, Dad. Forgiveness is not a switch I can flip. You missed my graduation. You ignored my letters. You stole my work. You cannot sign a paper and fix that." I walked to the door and held it open. "The door is not locked," I said. "If you want to know your daughter, the real one, not the one you invented, you can try. But you have to do the work. You have to change. And you have to do it without a title." He stood up, unsteady on his feet. He walked to the door, pausing as he passed me. He looked like he wanted to touch my arm, to offer some gesture of fatherhood, but he pulled back, respecting the distance I had set. "You are better than I ever was," he said softly. He walked out. I watched him go, a lonely figure disappearing down the long corridor of the company he founded, leaving it in the hands of the child he rejected. The next 3 months were a blur of reconstruction. We did not fire a single employee. I brought in my own team to work alongside the existing staff, retraining them, upgrading their skills, and integrating them into the Ether Logic culture. We stripped the stolen code out of the product, rebuilding the core architecture from scratch. It was expensive and time-consuming, but it was clean. For the first time, the software was legal, ethical, and entirely ours. Sarah took the lifeline I gave her. She moved to a smaller apartment, sold the luxury car she never actually liked, and started managing the seed fund. It was a struggle at first. She had to learn how to work without her father's safety net. But last week, I saw her laughing over coffee with a young female founder. Her face relaxed in a way I had never seen before. She was no longer performing. She was living. And my mother, the victory with my mother was the quietest. But it was the one that mattered most. She did not make a grand speech. She simply packed her bags and moved into a condo near the bay, a place with big windows and no shadows. She started painting again. And every Tuesday, I receive a letter in the mail, a real letter, with a stamp, written in her looping script. No one intercepts them. No one reads them but me. I stood on the balcony of my office, looking out at the San Francisco skyline. The wind whipped my hair across my face. People think winning looks like a movie. They think it is shouting and explosions and enemies weeping in the dirt. But standing there, I realized that real winning is quiet. It is the silence of a phone that no longer rings with demands. It is the peace of knowing your work is your own. It is the freedom of waking up and knowing that no one has power over you unless you give it to them. I had justice. I had my company. I had my family, broken and glued back together in a new, strange shape, but honest for the first time. I thought about the 14-year-old girl who sat in that living room, holding her breath, waiting for approval that never came. I wanted to tell her that she didn't need it. I wanted to tell her that the rejection was the fuel. They told me I had no tech talent. They told me my sister was the success story. They told me to be small. And now, the man who said those words had to knock on my door to enter the building. I turned back to my desk, where a new prototype was waiting. The screen glowed with lines of code, beautiful and infinite. Sometimes, the best revenge is not making them scream. It is not burning their house down. It is building a castle so tall, so strong, and so undeniable that they have no choice but to walk up the steps, knock on the gate, and ask for permission to enter. And when they do, they have to call you by your name. Juliana Walker. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Juliana's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people who need a reminder that success is the best revenge.